Hello and welcome back to my very messy workspace where we're currently knee-deep in a self-inflicted and yet absolute beast of a project to create an entire day's worth of Bridgerton or Regency inspired daywear. In previous videos in this playlist, we've made a nightgown, a dressing gown, 2 different types of stays, and most recently, the stay dress. Today we'll be finishing off that daytime look with a cropped jacket or spencer. For this project, we'll be using this gorgeous green suiting material, and I've been really wanting to get more into decorating, so I've got this lovely trim, and we'll see where that goes. But before we can do any of that, we need a pattern. Before making my design, I researched historical spencers and found quite a bit of variety in the actual shape and style, but did see a lot of really interesting embellishments that I wanted to incorporate. After playing around with piping and puff sleeves, I let Instagram decide what color the jacket would be, and they ended up deciding on green. And of course, we can't move on without a close-up of this adorable little creature. With a design in mind, it was officially time to draft the pattern. I'm using Seamly 2D, a free digital drafting software, to make mine. I started off with the back of the spencer, dividing it into 3 separate pieces, a curve at the bottom, a curve at the shoulder, and a center to cut on a fold. After assigning those as pattern pieces, I moved on to the front. I extended my center a little bit so that there was room for buttons, then I skipped the princess seam in favor of a single bust dart. I made a simple collar by creating a rectangle and adding some curves. Then I used the total waist measurement to create a little waistband, just a plain rectangle to be folded in half. To create volume for my puff over sleeve, I extended the width of this sleeve quite a bit, and then extended the length ever so slightly, and divided it up into little sections that will be slits in the final piece. I kept my inner sleeve pretty close to my arm measurements, and then divided it into 2 pieces so that there would be a center panel down the middle of the sleeve. At that point, it was time to print out my pattern and get it all assembled. In my opinion, the major flaw with Seamly 2D is that it doesn't actually let you place your pattern pieces in the final print layout, so the layouts are usually a bit of a mess. But a small inconvenience is better than paying for a pricey software. And you could of course do all of the drafting with just a paper and pen, but I've been working on getting better at digital drafting just as a fun hobby. Since we already have the green suiting, you might think that now it's time to cut out the fabric, but alas, it was time to go to the fabric store again because we had no lining. I got a little bit distracted by this gorgeous green satin that did come home with me for no purpose, and finished off the trip with some piping. Now we can cut out the fabric. We kind of breezed past it, but for the inner sleeve, that 2-part thing that I was talking about, I drafted it as 1 full sleeve and then chopped off like 2 inches or so on either side. And once that was printed, I taped those 2-inch pieces together so that like the center of the armpit is its own piece. After cutting out, we had 1 lining and 1 outer of the center back panel, 2 lining, 2 outer of the 2 curves, top and bottom, 2 outer of the collar, 1 of the waistband, 2 inner, 2 outer of the front bodice, 2 inner, 2 outer of the inner sleeve, and other part of the inner sleeve, and the outer sleeve. Okay, so I might be driving several hours tomorrow to pick up a clay order, but it does put me really close to Sedona, and if I can get this jacket done in 1 day, final results could be in a much prettier location. So I guess we're gonna give it a shot. Now, with immensely more stress than we originally planned, we can kick off the sewing on this project. I started off by assembling the back panel. I took the on-the-fold center back panel and pinned that to the curvy section that's at the waist and the curvy section that's at the shoulder for both the lining and the outer suiting material. Once they were pinned, I sewed them in place and followed it up with a quick serge to make sure nothing would fray after long-term use. Then to finish off these panels, I gave all of these fresh seams a quick press so they'd be nice and clean. The main thing to prep on the front panel is the bust dart, so I started out by transferring that marking over onto each of my layers of fabric. Then I sewed directly across the dart and over the edge so that I could tie a knot by hand and avoid any potential bulk because of the point getting too thick from backstitching. And of course I ironed it afterwards. And with that iron still hot, I figured now would be a great time to start on the collar. I used fusible interfacing to stiffen 1 layer of my collar, and then pinned the 2 layers together, took them to my sewing machine, and sewed all the way around the curved edge and the top edge, leaving the bottom edge of the 2 open. Before flipping it right side out, I serged those raw edges. Next up was the waistband. This is 1 5-inch wide, really long rectangle that I then folded in half and sewed along the short edges. I flipped my now 2-layer, 2.5-inch wide waistband right side out and pressed it. And with that, all of the main jacket elements, apart from the sleeves, were prepped and ready to go. Okay, we are officially moving on to the sleeves. I'm a little nervous. We have two different parts to handle. There's the oversleeve with its little slashes, and then the inner sleeve, which is currently in two parts. I suspect that the inner sleeve is going to be a little easier to put together, so we're going to start there, and then we'll move on to the puff outer sleeve a little bit later. The first step with the inner sleeve was to connect the thin strip to the big strip. It's really complicated to use the correct words for these sections because technically this is the inner and the over sleeve, but we already have the big puff sleeve and the thin inner sleeve, so it's all a mess. Words are hard. Anyway, we've sewn one edge of our skinny sleeve to our thick sleeve, and now we're just sewing the other side so that we now have one closed, close-fitting sleeve. And apparently that is the exact amount of concentrated sewing my brain can handle before it decides to go to Target and buy mini candies to restock my tiny vending machine, and also cookies because they were on sale. And let me tell you, editing mode Felicia really appreciates that restock side quest. Anyway, back to the project. Shirley will be distraction-free from now on. The sleeves are a little bit short. It's a bit awkward, so we're going to add a cuff, but before we do that, we're going to sew them together around the wrists, and oh, okay. Now we are fiddling with the air conditioning, because apparently that vent has been closed for a little while, and it's really absurdly hot in here, despite the fan. Now we can focus. I stuffed the lining sleeve inside the outer sleeve with the wrong sides facing, then pinned and sewed all the way around the wrist circumference. Once the wrists were connected, I moved on to connecting the lining and the outer layer around the armscye or armhole seam. With the two layers of the sleeves now staying together, I measured out the width of my wrist so that I could cut out a cuff piece to extend that total length. When I dug the fabric out again, I realized that there were a couple other areas that I would need additional pieces for. I cut out 2 rectangles for the wrist cuffs out of the suiting, 2 out of the lining for the bicep cuffs on the puff sleeve, and 24 little strips that'll be used later on the puff sleeve for bias tape. I hadn't planned to have a cuff or any kind of decoration on the end of my sleeve, but since I was creating this separate piece, I decided to add a little bit of trim right above the wrist. I cut 2 strips of trim to go all the way across each cuff, and then sewed them on the seam allowance of the short edge. At this point, I wasn't sure if I would be able to use my machine to sew the trim in place, so I went ahead and hand-stitched all of these, which is my definition of hell. Hand stitching is awful. Once the trim was attached, I folded the cuffs in half lengthwise and ironed them with a 1/2-inch seam allowance on the long edges. Then I folded them and sewed them together the opposite direction so the short edges were touching and the cuff formed a full circle. I slipped the cuff inside of the sleeve so that the right side was facing the lining, sewed all the way around, and then flipped it and top stitched one more time all the way around. And that finished off the inner sleeve. Okay, it's 9:45, and I still have a 30-minute workout to do, so we're gonna leave it off at this for today and hope that my clay order gets delayed. Rather conveniently, the clay order was in fact delayed. For day 2 of officially sewing, I got to work on the oversleeve. The first step was flatlining the inner and outer layers together for each of the puffs. I pinned all the way around both pattern pieces and sewed them together. Next, I used my pattern to transfer all of those slash marks onto my flat-lined pieces. Then I used a long bias stitch to just sew the straight line where the slash would eventually be. That part wasn't totally necessary, but it did help me visualize to make sure I was happy with the placement. It also helped me decide that instead of just a straight cut, I wanted kind of like a curvy triangular leaf around each of the slash marks. I had so much fabric to decrease the length of on that bottom edge, so doing these little leaf shapes helped me take some of that out without just relying fully on basting. I used those stitches as a guide and then cut out all of those little leaf shapes, which was admittedly nerve-wracking. Then to seal up all of the raw edges we just created, I made bias tape out of the satin strips that we cut. I pinned a length of the bias tape along each of the slash lines on the lining side first, sewed that in place, then flipped it over to the right side of the fabric and top stitched it down one more time. After sealing all 12 of the cut marks with the bias tape, this is how the oversleeves are currently looking. And now we've got to turn them into actual sleeves instead of just pancakes, so I took those 2 short edges and sewed them together, finishing off the raw edges with the serger. After setting my machine back up to its longest stitch, I basted along the top edge and the bottom edge of the sleeve. Okay, let's do a little face-to-face check-in. We've already made both of our undersleeves with a little embroidery and the close fit on them. And then we have our outer sleeves, which are about halfway done now. To make this a functional puff sleeve, we're going to use our basting stitches to condense this circumference quite a bit on both the top edge and the bottom edge. And then in each one of these little openings, we're going to put a little decorative piping thing with these 12 strips of fabric. These ones first need to be sewn into a tube, and then once we have a tube, we'll flip them right side out, do a couple of quick guide stitches, and then thread piping through them, which is somewhere around here. My workstation is a mess. And then the last step of the puff sleeves is the actual cuff that'll finish up the bottom edge and hold it in place like quite a bit closer to the surface. The surface being my arm. That's a weird way to say that. So yeah, 3 things to combine in just this oversleeve. Let's wrap it up so we can combine our sleeves and actually assemble this jacket. For the little loops, I took strips of fabric that were about 8 inches by 3 inches and sewed them in half like a tube. Then I used a safety pin to rotate all of them right side out, which was time consuming. After making it through my big stack of these, I ironed them all flat, then top stitched a series of straight lines to form channels. Originally I made 3 channels, but my piping turned out to be way too thick for that, so I ripped out the middle and only had 2 rows of piping. And I fed that piping through with just a yarn needle. To finish off the puff sleeve, I added a satin cuff the same way we added the cuff at the end of the inner sleeve, pressing it in half, pressing down the 1/2-inch seam allowance, then sewing the short edges together with right sides facing. Before we add the cuffs to their puffs, we have to gather the bottom edge of the puff using the basting stitch we already had. Once the 2 fit together, I pinned the cuff to the inside of the puff and sewed all the way around. Then I folded the cuff right sides out and flipped it over the raw edge of the outside of the puff sleeve and then top stitched that down. We are now so close to being done with these sleeves. I gathered the top edge of the puff to fit the top edge of the inner sleeve, and as I pinned them together, I stuck the little piping loops through the holes, pinning them so that the piping was slightly staggered on the seam and wouldn't clog my machine quite as badly. Finally, I sewed the outer sleeve around the inner sleeve along the armhole. I guess we have to sew the body of this jacket now. I have actually been putting this section off for a reason. The lining was super straightforward. I just sewed the shoulder seams together and the side seams, serging all of the raw edges as I went. After test fit to confirm that the lining fit just right, I had no choice but to figure out the trim. There were a lot of different patterns I could have played with, but I ended up trying out the one that I drew first and liking it well enough to just stick with it. Which probably should have been obvious, but I had felt super intimidated by this process. I measured out the length of each little loop and cut strips of trim to match it. Then I evenly spaced pins down the front of the bodice. I was really careful while pinning my trim in place because I was nervous that I would end up causing distortions in the fabric. I settled on starting with 2 as a little tester, pinned those in place, and then decided to try machine sewing because this trim has a little section down the middle where it'll hide the stitches. I sewed really slowly down the center of each one of these, and once I was satisfied with that test, I ended up doing all of them the same way. Turns out decorating with trim is really fun, and once I had finished all of this, I started immediately debating how else I could incorporate it to balance out the material. I landed on adding a loop to each shoulder and then adding trim around the edge of the collar and the waistband. I didn't want the stitches to show through on both layers of the collar, so I only pinned the trim to the top layer and then very delicately sewed it around the outside edge. After that, I sandwiched the shoulder seam with another little loop. At this point, I was building up the confidence to actually sew at full speed, so this took so much less time than trying to do the front really delicately. And the last bit of trim that I added was to the waistband, tucking the raw edges inside the seam. Oh look, more hand sewing and so many buttons to put on. Then poof, they're attached, and it's many hours later. After so many steps, we are finally ready for the final assembly. First, I sewed the lining and the outer layer together along the front opening. Then I flipped it so that the lining was laying flat inside. Then I sewed the 2 layers together along the neck, the armholes, and the waist. With the lining facing out, I stuffed the sleeves into the armhole and pinned all the way around, which was so thick at this point. The feed dogs on my machine said, yeah, no, and I ended up having to pull this through mostly on manual. After that painstaking process and the last bit of serging in this project, the sleeves were officially attached and it was time to move on to the collar. I sewed the side that did not have interfacing or trim down first, in much the same way that we sewed the cuffs on, attaching that non-interfaced side to the lining side, then flipping it over and top stitching along the outside. After all that, the waistband was left as the final item on the assembly list. And in a shocking turn of events, it was attached the exact same way that the cuffs and the collar were. With all the pieces attached, the final task was unfortunately more hand sewing, as I needed something to hold the jacket closed. While I'd originally planned for buttons, I opted for a pair of hook and eyes instead. It is way too hot